Hello and welcome back to Scottish Independence Podcasts. This week's podcast we take a look at the recent application to the UN by the group Liberation.Scot to have Scotland declared a colony and put forward for decolonisation. Wow! Regular listeners might remember back in October 23, we interviewed Professor Alf Baird about his book Doonhodden, which documents his academic research into the socio-political determinants of Scottish independence. And a lot of that book is drawn from the experience of colonisation worldwide. Now, it was one of our most popular podcasts, so it's obviously something people are interested in. Recently, there has been quite a development because Liberation.Scot, with which Alf is involved, has submitted a petition to the United Nations to apply for Scotland to be formally added to the list of countries awaiting decolonisation. Now, this opens up all sorts of issues, including the validity of the 1707 treaty and the way it was implemented, but much more relevant and I think probably more fertile ground for the independence cause is the relationship between Scotland and its place within the UK as a supposed equal partner, although that equal partner does not have a full measure of self-determination as any other independent country and partner in a union would have. So Alf was interviewed recently on the TNT show. As always, it's a very interesting interview. Covered some of the same ground as our original talk with him, but given this new context and the latest developments, it is worth going over some of those concepts again. So this is the audio version of that TNT show. If you want to watch the video version, it's on our Independence Live YouTube channel. And we'll link to that in the notes, as well as to Alf's book called Doonhodden, which is available from all good booksellers.
Hello, and welcome to the TNT show. Let's move on to our great guest tonight. We have Professor Alf Baird with us, and we'll be talking about a variety of things, his books and also his thoughts on the union between England and Scotland. And I think some of you will find it surprising about the nature of that relationship, how it began and how it's developed since then, and what these ramifications have for the constitution of the UK, but also for the way forward for Scotland. Alf, how are you?
I'm very well, John. Good evening.
Let's talk about your book. Why did you write it?
I wrote it. I was active during the independence referendum and before it, a couple of years before it, in the Academics for Yes group, publishing articles about why Scotland should be independent and what benefits there might be from that. And I wasn't, after the referendum or around then, I wasn't convinced that the people would really fully understand what independence meant. So because I'm a researcher, I decided to research as much of the literature as I could. It's a research textbook, basically. It looks at theory on independence within Scotland and further afield, and what we can learn from that, and also looks into what's known as post-colonial theory. That's the writers who have written about colonialism as it's happened, before, during colonialism and after colonialism. It's called post-colonial theory. So from this, I was able to develop a theoretical framework, which is what I was able to do in my other research projects going back a number of years, and from what we call grounded theory method, which is using existing theories and information to develop a new theory. And I developed a theoretical framework. There's 9 dimensions there to independence. These are what I call determinants of independence: culture, language, demographics, colonialism, nationalism, institutions, constitution, ethnicity, and self-determination. The 9 determinants. So what it basically demonstrates is that independence is a very multifaceted kind of situation, requiring analysis of each of these dimensions, careful analysis, to explain the phenomenon of independence, and really what it is, which I found it was decolonisation. And if you look at the UN information on independence, it's all about decolonisation. So you have to think about independence in a slightly different way a lot of these issues were never addressed during the referendum campaign. Everybody focused on what the mainstream media was focusing on as well, was pensions, defence, currency, economics, these kind of things. But what I found is that some of the key aspects here were not considered, and it actually came out in post-referendum research Edinburgh University did, which showed that a lot of the vote was to do with belonging and sense of identity. In effect, how Scottish do you feel and how British do you feel? But how these senses of belonging are determined, you need to then embrace some of these behavioural and psychological issues. Remembering also that colonialism is based on psychology. It's not necessarily based on what you think is best for your country. It's based on your mindset in that sense. You know, the first two dimensions there, culture and language, very important, because you won't get an independence movement without national consciousness. And Scottish national consciousness comes from these two dimensions, our culture and our language, and particularly the Scots language. Because most Scots speak the Scots language. We didn't ken it. It's a great language. It's a broad language, but in colonial terms, we're deprived of it. We don't learn it. We didn't learn it, and it's made invalid. And that is one of the key colonial procedures imperial powers adopt and implement to any colonised power. You know, I mean, I think India was the first colony that English studies was imposed on. Even before Scots.
Yeah, well, maybe some places in the Caribbean too. I noticed there's no reference to economics there. Is that a subset?
No, it comes in completely under the colonialism banner, because colonialism is fundamentally, first and foremost, about economic exploitation. That's the objective of colonialism. It's done also politically and culturally. But its fundamental objective is economic exploitation. So the reason why Scotland is held so closely by Westminster is it's a very, very valuable resource in many different ways. And that is where the economics come in. It's also partly to do with institutions as well. And the institutions within a colonial society, as I would argue is that Scotland is, tend to adopt the values of the colonial power. So it's the values that are very important here, and that's linked also to culture. So the cultural values are very important. And here a good example is, of course, the privatization ethos of the English government, as I would say, the England as Britain government, Westminster. Its focus is very much on privatization and private ownership, private profit. And that's what all the privatization policies were about, which is at odds with Scotland's traditional cultures and concepts, and even today, the value of an egalitarian society and the common good, the focus on the common good, which is also embodied in the Claim of Right, which is a condition of the Treaty of Union, the Claim of Right Act 1689. So Scotland's culture and traditions and values are fundamentally different from what we've had imposed these last 300 years, particularly the last 50 years with these efforts to fully privatize public utilities. And I'm thinking most of my research was on seaports, and the UK government went furthest of any country in the world really to privatize seaports, the land, the operations, as well as the regulatory powers. And the same with airports and other utilities to some extent adopt a kind of self-regulatory process. And they've all went to eventually become owned by offshore equity funds. So Scotland is really just a big asset play, offshore equity funds. So Scotland, in a sense, the land, the resources have all been disposed of, irrespective of what the Scots wanted. We never really voted for Thatcherism, but by God, we got it. And plus we got the economic collapse as well. We got the deindustrialization just a few years before peak global demand for steel, as you all know. And all our industries were shut down. In addition to that, we generate an enormous amount of energy now, but we get no royalties for it. And we have, paradoxically, the highest electricity prices, certainly amongst all the oil-rich countries of the world, but probably we have the highest electricity prices in the world now, as far as I can see, 4 times higher than Norway. And that's why we can't compete industrially.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, some people would push back against your claim that Scotland is a colony. They would say, well, hold on a second, colonies are not represented at the main parliament. Canada was a colony, India was a colony, South Africa was a colony, but they didn't have representation at Westminster. Scotland does.
Yes, that's right. Even Malta was offered 1 seat at Westminster, perhaps 2, but refused it and became independent. But Ireland, of course, had many seats in Westminster. But previous UN investigations have suggested that Ireland was colonised. And Ireland became independent, the Republic, at least the rest subject to partition, which is the usual UK imperial policy of exit of colonies, and something Scotland has to be concerned about as well. So, I think but of course at the time of union, which was a bit of a hoax, it was even admitted by commentators at the time that the entry of 40 odd Scots on the seats at Westminster would have no effect, because they have no veto. There's no Scottish veto on English laws. It's basically imposition of English laws. And that's what happened with Wales's annexation, and also to a larger degree Ireland. So that's why the Treaty of Union, treaties are, of course, in colonialism, pretty much every colonised people was handed a worthless treaty. It all looked nice and it was all presented to them by very well-spoken gentlemen usually, but it was immediately violated and never really implemented to any great extent. And that's the same with Scotland. Scotland's had numerous violations of the treaty. The treaty violations continue, but in a sense, it's never been implemented because it was supposed to be a united kingdom and 1 crown, but we're left with 2 crowns still.
There's a point here that you make. It says, the UK Parliament therefore remains subject to the superior, in brackets, i.e. sovereign, close brackets, power of the treaty's signatory parties, that is, the sovereign kingdoms of Scotland and England, either of whom may permanently withdraw their representatives from the UK Parliament, following which the Union Act would be repealed.
Well, that's the general international law relating to treaties. Any treaty partner signatory has the power to withdraw from it. When a treaty is no longer in your nation's interest, it should be ended. And that is normal international rules and reasoning behind treaty making. So the reason Scotland has not done that is the question. Why has it not withdrawn from the treaty that's was never really in Scotland's interest anyway? And it was a corrupt treaty, as we know, to begin with. It was not required by the people. The people opposed it, and it was subject to extensive bribery and coercion. So the threat of military force was there as well. So there's coercion and bribery involved. So I would say to anybody that wants to suggest that the treaty should be upheld, they need to think about its origins, first of all, which was criminal. So there is that respect. But in a sense, a signatory party to a treaty must have the right to withdraw from it. That's under international law. That the Scottish representatives have not done so is a matter they really need to address.
I saw a clip featuring Angus Robertson, who was asked this sort of question recently. And his answer was, well, there's only one way to do this, and that is to appeal to the British state, i.e. that the proper route would be through some sort of referendum, which resulted, should the referendum be successful, in a Scotland Independence Act passed by the Westminster Parliament. I think that's called his preferred route.
That's his preferred option. But the reality is, in the situation Scotland finds itself in, once you elect majorities of nationalists, they're expected to do the necessary. That is to withdraw and to enter into treaties that they feel are positive, and to leave treaties that they feel are negative. So before the devolution, of course, whenever there was a nationalist majority envisaged, even the Tories admitted that was sufficient for Scotland to be independent. Yeah. And to negotiate its way out of the Union. So Mrs. Thatcher agreed that, Norman Tebbit said that in the House, numerous others said it as well. And then all of a sudden, when we start getting majorities of SNP MPs in Westminster, somebody somewhere changes the hurdles. But essentially in colonialism, as Albert Memmi, the great colonial theorist, said, the colonizer will always make independence seem impossible for the colonized. They will always make it seem impossible. And that's exactly what the unionists have done. Since the union began, they've said it's impossible. But essentially, it's up to nationalist representatives when they're elected, and a nationalist majority in a colony is usually de facto independence. In any other colony, when you get a nationalist majority elected, that is and standing on an independence ticket.
Isn't this the nub of it that we're getting to now, Alf? Is that people don't know what an SNP representative stands for.
Yeah.
On the one hand, they're elected on the basis that they support independence. However, in the next breath, they're saying we have to go down to Westminster to represent our constituents. Now, that seems to be an acceptance that they're not really nationalists, they're something in between. Until somebody comes along and helps them to resolve that, they plan to opt for a devolved arrangement. Even though they're carrying a badge that says, I'm a nationalist, they're a nationalist with a very small n, perhaps. And eventually what happens is an accommodation is arrived at, where these people are allowed to say what they want in the floor of the House. But again, it seems to me it's very difficult when your objectives are split.
I have to say, post-colonial theory is quite clear on what happens with a dominant national party in which the people put their faith. And what happens is basically what we see. So we have a dominant national party, and it essentially takes its foot off the gas once it's elected. It does actually rely on the ultimate, the generosity of the imperial power to open the door to liberation, which is a forlorn hope. And a waste of time largely. But what happens?
Isn't that forlorn hope created by this schizoid approach, which is that I accept I'm elected to represent my constituents, which means I have to compromise, but at the same time I'm carrying a badge called nationalist, which means I don't compromise. How do you resolve that?
Well, in a sense, they're no longer nationalists, are they? Because a nationalist in a state of colonialism. Remember, colonialism is regarded as a scourge, a form of punishment on a people. Yeah. That's how the UN define it. So you're a non-self-governing territory. All your assets are taken out at will by the imperial power, and your culture is obliterated and destroyed, and your people are cast to all the far corners of the world and largely replaced, as what happened in Scotland to some extent. So we have that situation. The role of the nationalist representatives is to liberate the people. My findings in my research tell me that colonialism, to end it, you have to decolonize, and that's what the UN describe as independence. And most countries that have become independent have done it through the decolonization process of the United Nations.
My point is, isn't it much easier if you don't serve in the, as you would put it, the colonial parliament? I mean, the reason it's perhaps a lot easier for Malta and South Africa and India
Ireland, yeah.
They're not, well, no, Ireland is not that, but they weren't sending representatives to Westminster. There wasn't that conflict of interest. Mm-hmm. Now we've had some people write in and say, well, if you just withdraw your representatives from Westminster, then you would be labelled as rebels, and it would achieve nothing, and the unionists would be cock-a-hoop.
Well, that's for some people to say, but nationalists have to if the nationalists seeking to make their country independent, they have to step up to the plate at the end of the day. What we find in post-colonial theory is it tells us the national party becomes petrified. It becomes immobilized. It suffers from that petrifaction. It lacks innovation. It seeks an accommodation with the colonial power. It takes the people up, the movement up a blind alley then. And that's what leads to the rupture in the movement. We have a ruptured independence movement. We have had, over the last few years, the National Party, SNP, has lost more than half of its members now. Why has that happened? It's because we have this rupture. We've had new parties then created. That's part of the model, the decolonisation template. So we see what that happens here. The elite in the National Party, they become part of the racket, if you like. In some places, they've actually behaved like a gang, and they've imposed. They've attacked even radicals. They've used the forces of the state.
Forgive me, I'm still slightly confused here, Alf, because I think this argument would carry more weight if, for example, Alex Salmond had said, let's withdraw our representatives from Westminster. But he didn't. He went along with all of this stuff.
Yeah.
In fact, he served in both places, for crying out loud.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
How much more subservient can you be than that?
Yeah.
I'm saying that with some degree of concern because, I knew Alec, I admired Alec, but it seems to me there's a basic contradiction there.
I'll tell you what I found in my research is that what the post-colonial theorists tell you is the National Party elite never undertake a reasoned study of colonial society. So they don't really understand how grim the situation really is, especially for the most impoverished people in the country. We're sitting here in a country that's very rich, but has about half the people living in are close to poverty, and with a GDP the lowest in Northwest Europe, and the highest electricity prices in Northwest Europe, if not the world. So we're in a hellish position for most people. But what you find is the political elite join in the racket, as it were, become part of the system. They seek that accommodation with colonialism. And that's what the post-colonial model tells you happened in many places around the world. And Scotland, remember, has a very Anglophone bourgeoisie. It has, and the bourgeoisie in post-colonial theory come in for particular criticism because the bourgeoisie are the most pampered element, and the most pampered group in the colonial society. And they have a lot going for them. But that's part and parcel of the whole thing. We have quite a significant bourgeoisie. We also have a large public sector with about a third of the jobs in Scotland public sector related, and probably half the wages go in the public sector. And most of the Holyrood budget is wages. Yeah. And so what the colonial administration does is it's pumping out that money to keep the system going. It's, in a sense, it's the wages of colonialism. But what we don't know, and what I've calculated and others have tried to calculate, is what the cost of colonialism really is. And I've estimated, based on GDP analysis per capita, compared with other countries with a lot less resources than us, that our leakage is about 150 billion a year. So the cost of colonialism...
150 billion?
150 billion a year. If you say, assumed our GDP per capita should be equivalent to Denmark, for example, it's only $60,000, $70,000 a year. We're 40,000. Norway and Ireland over 100,000, Switzerland over 100. So if we were reasonably to say that our GDP per capita should be about $65,000, $70,000, we're losing 150 billion a year. And that's a lot of money.
That's an enormous amount of money.
It's a lot of money. But you can think about
I'm
it.
absolutely convinced of this, because it just sounds extraordinary to me.
Well, why is Denmark's GDP so much higher? It has no resources compared to Scotland.
Well, it's got Greenland.
But it pays to keep Greenland. It doesn't get any money out of it. But and I've been to Nuuk. It's a very interesting place. But yeah, that's the cost of colonialism. Broadly, also in post-colonial theory, the cost of the cost of colonialism is equivalent to the extent of poverty and deprivation as well that the people face.
Do you agree with the concept as is presently underway about going to the UN and saying to the UN, we're a colony and we would appeal to the UN to help us do something about that? Is that something you support?
Well, that was the findings in my book, which suggested that if the political process fails, as it's done, and we have successive independence mandates, 6 mandates for referendums now, 3 at Holyrood, 3 at Westminster, mandates in favour of another referendum on independence, all blocked by the imperial power, then you don't have any other option but to use international law.
Well, hold on a second. Some people would say, yeah, you've got lots of options. I mean, Gandhi was told he had no options. He chose civil disobedience.
Yes.
What he did was to say to the imperial parliament, of course you can continue ignoring us, but it's going to cost you a bunch.
Yes, but what we find with Holyrood, of course, it's not interested in civil disobedience.
Yes,
I think what we have to also remember is, although we have nationalist politicians there, or nominally nationalist, as Peter Bell calls them, we have a civil service that's managed from Whitehall.
Yeah.
Our civil service is not nationalist. We have a government that says it's nationalist. Well, it actually doesn't want to be nationalist anymore, because the SNP over the last few years have come to regard the term nationalism as not something they would want to necessarily associate with. But nationalism is, in self-determination sense, is about liberation of the people, about independence, about decolonisation. It's not transnational nationalism, which is what the British Union imposes, right, and what other regimes have done. So yeah, it's about understanding our situation a bit better. So the institutions loom large in this, and that's one of the determinants of independence. You might have a nationalist sitting in Holyrood, but your civil service and your governance throughout the Scotland is not nationalist. It's anything but.
It is an interesting point. I mean, I've always been uncomfortable with the idea that the head of the civil service in Edinburgh reports to somebody in London who does not necessarily regard that reporting line as terribly senior. They would look at the Department of Health, they would look at Defence and regard them as senior appointments, but not necessarily the person sitting in the top civil service job.
Well, there was a famous study, not well publicised, by Professor Michael Hechter on the internal colonial model of the UK. And he regarded Scotland's meritocracy as a cultural, what he called a cultural division of labour. So all the top jobs are advertised in the London press, the civil service and everything send their best people up to manage the Celtic periphery. So that's what we've had. We've had that for over a century. You know, in late Victorian times, there was only over 30,000 people in Edinburgh, living in Edinburgh from England. and so all the institutions, I did an analysis of universities, which I spent a large part of my career in, and I found that in quite a few of certainly the ancient ones, it was only about 10% of the academics were Scottish, which would be a scandal in Norway. You know, yeah. if you or Denmark, if you said that 90% of the academics in Denmark were German, you know, you would think they were still under a certain regime that controlled them during the Second War. But that's another matter.
Let me put another argument to you that some people have raised with me, and they've said, well, we don't quite understand what's happening about going to United Nations. It may work out, it may not. We'd rather prefer to do it through the British state. We don't think the Scottish government's been nearly assertive enough, but maybe there's a bit of change in attitude and they might find a backbone and become slightly more nationalist. Mm-hmm. But then they say, but of course, this is all wrong. The timing is terrible because we've got a US president who is capricious, mean-minded, and liable to go off at a tangent. You know, this is the wrong time to be making these assertions, going to United Nations, stirring things up. Surely we should keep our heads down and wait until this Trump typhoon tornado dissipates itself. And then once international relations are back to some form of normality, then that would be the time to make these representations. What do you say to that?
Well, the NGOs in Geneva say that what we're doing is entirely lawful and required under the resolutions that the UN have made. So we have, first of all, a denial of self-determination. That's a repeated denial. You know, there's 6 mandates that I can see that where the SNP campaigned for a referendum on independence, all been denied. We still have colonial exploitation, and that's one of the fundamental issues the UN will look at. You know, looking at even renewables coming up, 60 billion worth of renewables by 2030, probably 100 billion worth not long after. It's going to dwarf oil and gas value. That's one of the reasons why Scotland is held tight. We get no royalties from this. You looked at aghast when I said we're worth 150 billion a year to all these offshore equity funds and others that are basically screwing Scotland. But that's the reality. And with renewables is a classic example, a big example. We also have the historic misrepresentation of Scotland. Back in 1960, the UK was asked, what is at the height of decolonisations that the UN was dealing with post World War II, what is Scotland's position? And Scotland's position was they were told was one of an equal or a voluntary partner in a union, but Scots weren't really asked that at the time. We could have decolonised even then. So there's all these different things. We have had democratic violations in the sense of the referendum that's been mandated has not been held. Scotland has a right also to self-determination. That's an inalienable right. Nobody else has the right to tell us we can't have a referendum on self-determination or anything else, even the UK Supreme Court, which itself is another violation of the treaty. So all these things are unlawful internationally and go against what the UK signed up to, these UN resolutions on self-determination. So it's the UK government that's playing fast and loose with UK international laws and resolutions that the UN abide by.
Interesting. So your view is that it doesn't really matter what's happening in the States, elsewhere, tariffs, whatever, that this is a line that ought to be pursued. And would you expect, I'm not saying anticipate, but would you expect that that there will be a positive reception from the UN? Or do you feel that whatever the UN decides, it will attract negative publicity and people will say, well, why haven't you kept things here at home? You've gone to involve people elsewhere in New York, and where do we go from here now?
I think it will be of high interest to the UN. Remember also there's a lot of the non-self-governing territories that remain to be decolonised are administered by the UK. And there's also another non-self-governing territory, the Falklands or Malvinas, that's a matter of long-standing conflict with the Argentinians. So the other aspect here, of course, we're going back to the formation of the UK. The UK treaty was never implemented. It was never implemented. England's government never changed. Scotland's parliament was abolished, but England's parliament was not. England's parliament continued, just with the addition of a few Scots, and England's crown has continued, but Scotland's crown has been in a kind of perpetual limbo ever since. So there's a whole range of different issues here that could be interesting or should be interesting to constitutional minded people, but essentially the avenues there. I think what also it will create is an interest and awareness of people in Scotland that the situation here is not all it seems. It's all it's presented by the mainstream media as a union, a one nation Britain, as it were. And of course, in colonial theory, and the idea of Britishness is a bit of a cultural illusion, and that goes back to the cultural aspects of colonialism. Colonialism is about making a people change their identity. And that's been attempted in a significant way with Scots to reduce their sense of belonging to the Scottish culture and identity and to make themselves feel more British. So essentially all these aspects of colonialism have to be dealt with. In post-colonial theory, the fight for independence is a fight for a national culture, essentially. It's not about necessarily riches or about how we deal with currency or how we deal with the EU or defence. It's about reclaiming national culture and self-recovery of that culture and getting away from the cringe.
Yeah, I thought that was significant in the 2014 referendum. I mean, I had lots of reservations about the way that was done from a nationalist perspective. I've talked before on this programme about the fact that we went into that like a one-club golfer. We weren't prepared to say very many negative things about the union, and therefore we left that whole area wide open to the Better Together campaign to fill it full of all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, well, one of the aspects they homed in on was trade, and global trade. Global trade is something I've been studying for a long time. It was subject to my PhD as well, and shipping. And what I found was that pretty much all the countries that decolonised from the UK, the first thing they did was to reorientate their trade away from the UK. What we had in the referendum campaign was the UK side, the unionist side, saying, well, Scotland's trade is dependent on England. But that's what colonialism does. It makes you dependent. It makes a place. So we're a dependency in that sense, but it's not a good one because they take out our trade cheap and they sell us everything back dear. And that's what the colonial relationship is.
That's the very point I tried to make to them. I said, you have to tell people the negative impact of the present system.
Yeah.
And they said, no, we leave that to them. We want to be unremittingly positive. And I felt that was just a terrible mistake.
Yeah.
Because what clinched things in the end, it seems to me, was the third offer. I mean, the deal that was struck was it was either yes or no. And then at the 11th hour, all of a sudden there was a middle position offered, which should have been disallowed, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Because people were now caught in two minds. They thought they could vote for independence, but choose a middle way to do it.
Well, one of the options that the UN has with countries that are non-self-governing territories seeking to decolonize is to ensure there's no external interference in any referendum.
Yeah.
And the problem with the 2014 referendum is it was full of external interference. It was absolutely, totally dominated by the British media. That was one of the major problems. It was also the franchise. I've questioned in Doon Hodden, with the franchise is very irregular because it's Holyrood uses a local government franchise. It's the Scotland Act imposes a local government franchise on Holyrood, probably because Tony Blair and Donald Dewar and the rest of them thought it was just as he called it, a parish council.
Yeah.
So and because it's not a real parliament, it's not a sovereign parliament, they gave it a local government franchise. But you never use a local government franchise for national matters, for national elections or certainly not referendum on constitutional matters. And that is the norm globally. And wherever I looked in any other country, no other country would have adopted that franchise. And so we need a proper franchise. We need a proper mechanism for any future referendum, if there needs to be one. Because a referendum, bear in mind, is not a matter of law essential requirement for independence.
Yeah, well, I mean, your book. I mean, you're kind enough to send me a copy back in 2020. Your thoughts on this subject must have been around at the time of the referendum. Were you ever consulted by anyone? Did anyone ever come to you and say, "Well, you're a voice that is putting a particular perspective that might be helpful to us in the referendum"? Did you have any role in that?
No, I think there were many voices calling on the SNP, certainly after the referendum, to do something differently, and certainly after the election of the 56 roaring lions in 2015. I mean that to me was, there were people like myself calling then for withdrawal from Westminster, and basically that would have been a declaration of independence. But any majority of Scotland's MPs was always regarded, if they were nationalists, they were able to withdraw Scotland from the treaty. If anybody had a problem with that, they could always test it in a court. And personally, I would have loved to see that tested in the Scottish court, because which way would the judges go? Would they go with a majority of Scots holding up Scottish sovereignty, or would they go with a minority still running down to Westminster holding Scotland's sovereignty in their hands? And that's the reality. Who holds the political sovereignty? Is it England's MPs? Is it a minority of Scots, or is it a majority of Scots? And it has to be a majority of Scots. Otherwise, the treaty isn't worth anything. And we know that the treaty isn't worth anything. But it would have been good to test it, because the treaty has been violated so much. It's really not worth the paper it was scribbled on. But there we go. We're in that situation. We have to realise that all colonised people, as I say, were handed worthless treaties. Scotland was handed a worthless treaty. We're just using England's Parliament to enact laws for Scotland. That's all we're doing. And they get to do that as long as Scots are represented there. As long as Scotland's MPs go down to Westminster, England's Parliament has a right to legislate for Scotland according to the treaty. But if they don't venture down there, that right is no longer valid.
Yeah, but as we said at the beginning, it would just take one unionist MP to go down, and that would be it.
I don't think that would be the case. It has to be a meaningful. It has to be a majority of members. Otherwise, people will see that it's just a fraud anyway.
So let's assume that the appeal to the UN falls on deaf ears, or more likely gets subsumed into the machinations of the UN, which is what happens to a lot of things like this. Where does that leave things then? Where does one go?
As I say, I think this is in liberation and processes like this, what's very important is the educational process that people go through. As I said earlier on, what I believed was that the people they hadn't been told what independence really meant.
Yeah. And
my finding is independence means decolonisation. I don't know what the SNP think it means, the SNP members, the MPs and MSPs. I don't think they really know what independence really means, because they don't know what nationalists are supposed to do. and the role of the nationalist politician in a colonial situation has always been the same. Has always been to liberate its people and liberate his nation. If he doesn't do that and he's not able to do that, he should move out the way and let somebody else in that can do it. And that's why we've had the creation of new national parties. Independent Scotland Party is one party that's standing on a mandate. Well, it will abstain from. It will not take up its seats in Westminster if it's elected. And that was the same with Sinn Féin in Ireland. They were voted in Sinn Féin in the early 20s on the basis that they would not take their seats. Yeah. And that's what you have to do and be prepared to do.
Well, here's a question from, what do you think of the fact that we in Scotland contributed a large part to the British Empire, colonising and oppressing nations all over the world?
Well, I think what I've found, and what also in Liberation and Salvo have found with their research, is that many colonial peoples were used as colonial armies, for example. Indians are a good example. There was Nigerians as well, Irish too. The Scots were no different. One of the reasons why the Union was forged was not only to remove more rebellious Scots from Scotland, and that happened big style in the 1700s, but was also to gain access to Scotland's resources. And one of its main resources was its people. And the Scots armies were used in 200 colonial engagements, 80 conflicts since the war. This is the issue about matters of war and peace. If you're independent, you've got power over war and peace, matters of war and peace. If you're a colonial society like we are, you're ruled over by another set of values that will take you into war. And Scotland's been drawn into 80 conflicts since the end of World War II. 80 conflicts that Ireland has avoided through its independence. We've got another potential one at the moment, where London seems to think that going into Ukraine with military stuff and assets and people is a great idea. I would venture to suggest that most Scots would say that's not a good idea. And we would not do that had we been independent. So on matters of war and peace, it's very important that we do our own thing. But when you're a colonial society, you're sent to the front. You're sent to and Scots were always sent to the very front.
Yeah, I wouldn't argue with any of that, but I would also say that a number of Scots were involved willingly in exploitation of other countries.
Yeah,
there's no question about that. I mean, look at what happened in China. We're talking about, we're talking about a very serious drug running into China. It was masterminded by a whole number of Scots. They didn't do that because somebody held their arm up their back. They did it because they wanted to hold some cash.
Going back to post-colonial theory, what it tells us also is that colonialism is also a joint venture with native elites.
Yeah.
So the Scottish native elites loved it. They were into it in a big way. But just the same as Indian native elites, Irish native elites, and other countries, Kenyan native elites, Malaysian native elites, they were all part of the system. They become part of the system. The same with the French system in Africa. always had native elites, tribal leaders, all the rest of it were paid off. So it's nothing unusual. Of course, you have a native elites, the Scots native elite that's going into that in a big way. And of course, by the 1700s, 1800s, the Scottish native elite was largely Anglophone. You know, it has changed its values in a significant way. And that started, of course, in 1603 with the Union of the Crowns, the movement of the Scottish court down to London and all the rest of it, and the English education of Scottish aristocrat children. So it's once that value system becomes dominant in the elite class, that's part and parcel of colonialism. It's nothing unusual. But we have classical colonialism, which was to do with slavery and plantations in the Caribbean and so on. But we have post-colonial theory, which takes us to the modern times and the UN situation and the UN decolonisation program. And the UN, let's remember, was set up to reduce the powers of the great imperial powers and to increase decolonisation. That's what the UN was created for, largely, is to make a peaceful world and a trading world. A peaceful world, a trading world, and to decolonize and to stop this colonial oppression. So we have that situation now where we still have this situation that we have to address. The other thing about colonialism is if it's allowed to continue, the people and nation perish. And Scotland is in the process of perishing. We just need to look at the birth rate we have and our migration, our demographics. We can see that. But also in an underdeveloped sense, the colony is always underdeveloped. Its people are underdeveloped. It's lacking in opportunities. It's lacking in earnings and wealth, all the rest of it. But lacking in opportunities is the main one. And that's what caused a lot of the out-migration of Scots. Yeah. Lacking in opportunities in their own land, as most of us have got family that had to emigrate. Yeah. And that's
you're speaking to one of them. Any last concluding thoughts you would like to leave to our listeners and watchers and audience?
Yeah, I think really a call for unity amongst everybody focused on independence. Everybody to think about unity, because unity is one of the ways the only way we can overcome this burden that we face, the lack of opportunities for our people, and the lack of resources, access to their own resources. This is potentially a very wealthy country, but also one with great opportunities it should have for its own people and to stop the oppression. Doonhodden, I should say, is the Scots term for oppressed. Yeah. One of the things, I think, the great things the Scottish government could do is to introduce Scots language teaching into the schools. Yeah. Because language is central to our identity. And they're introducing Gaelic, which is fine for Gaelic speakers, but most of us are Scots speakers. And most of us have got a good Scots tongue in our head. And a lot of us know, but the Scots language, that's a human right as well. And it's a human right to learn your language, and that's the pride. So unity and culture and language, very central.
Your point is well made, Alf. Thank you very much for that. Well, I hope you've enjoyed the show as much as I have, folks, because Alf has been a great guest.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that. Don't forget to subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're listening on YouTube, you can click the little bell and you get a reminder whenever we put out a new episode, which is every Friday.
And sign up for our mailing list. You can do that from the website. And we always send one out at the beginning of each month to tell you what's happening. Last but not least, you can buy us a coffee on coffee.com.
And we'll catch you later. Bye now.